Did you hear that the U.S. Surgeon General last year declared a loneliness pandemic? Or not pandemic, but epidemic. Has anyone heard this? I remember hearing a little bit about it last year, but today and this week preparing, I started to think about it again. It's one of those odd things. You don't think the Surgeon General is going to be worried about loneliness. Like, how is that connected to physical health? The Surgeon General is about the physical health and sort of, setting the government's communication about all those things. So what does loneliness have to do with physical health? Well, it turns out a lot. So for example, the physical consequences of loneliness include a 29% increased risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke, and a 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. And then in general, loneliness leads to a 60% increased risk in premature death. And so this is why the Surgeon General and the government noticed that we have a problem and something that we need to take a look at. So the way they define loneliness is this: a subjective, distressing experience that results from perceived isolation or inadequate meaningful connections, where inadequate refers to the discrepancy or unmet need between an individual's preferred and actual experience, which is such a government type definition. But basically, it is subjective because all of us have different needs and perceived desires for relationships. But it's whenever somebody does not have what they desire in connection and belonging. And then they said, okay, so that's what people experience, but this is what they really need. And it talks about this idea of belonging, which is a fundamental human need, the feeling of deep connection with social groups, physical places, and individual and collective experiences. So those are definitions that is in this government report. And what they're saying is, we see that Americans are lonely. Americans are not connected like they want to be. It's not even as if we're saying, hey, this is something that humans need. They don't seem to want it, which is a problem. But this is, humans know they need this and they're not getting it. And people are lonely. And so it's a huge problem. And if you go look at the report, they've just tracked this, over the last 30 to 40 years. And they've just seen in recent years it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And even the pandemic, if anything, just exacerbated everything. But it was already bad before that. It wasn't as if that switch flipped and all of a sudden people got lonely. I mean, yes, some people were isolated, people had their systems taken apart. But loneliness is a real problem, which means that probably some of us might experience loneliness from time to time. And maybe even, if it's not you, it's someone definitely you know. Do you feel like you lack companionship? Do you feel isolated from others? Do you feel empty? Do you feel like you just don't fit in? Do you feel like no one knows you? These are the sorts of questions that you ask when you're thinking, are you lonely? Now, I think there's two answers to this epidemic. It's really a two-part answer. There's a first part and a second part, and the two go together. And I want to talk about that today. And I want to say it starts with God, which we should expect, right? But I want to think about what that actually means. It starts with God, but God isn't the only answer. It starts with God. So today, if you were to take out your Bible, turn to John chapter 10. This is our gospel reading for today, John 10. If you want to follow along in the Pew Bible, it is on page 1528. John 10, 11 through 18, and it will be on the screen here. So let's take a look at this passage from John 10. Verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So this is Jesus talking to a group of his disciples and religious leaders and the crowd of people who were there listening. This is Jesus talking. And he says, I am the good shepherd. Now, he doesn't just pull that out of anywhere. There's a long tradition in the Hebrew Bible of God referring to himself as a shepherd for his people, his sheep. And there's also a strong tradition of God's leaders, priests and kings, that together are leading God's people as their shepherds on God's behalf. And so the idea is still that the king and the priests are following God, the great shepherd, but they're leading the people. And so Jesus recognizes all of those ideas, and he says about himself, I am the good shepherd. Now, of course, probably the best place to go to see this is our psalm from today. This is just that first verse to remind you, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. And the psalmist who's writing this psalm, we think David, we don't know. I think David's attributed with this one. David is saying, I have a shepherd and it's God. Now, when you look more closely at that psalm, this is some of the things that you see that God does as the good shepherd. He knows and he meets his people's needs because he cares for his people. He protects his people. He blesses his people, and in the sense that he knows what they need and he meets their needs. And it exceedingly meets their needs. And he is always faithful to his people. He never abandons them. So from the beginning, God is this good shepherd. And so then Jesus comes in and he says, I am the good shepherd. I have come to be the one who cares for you and leads you. So when we think about loneliness, the first thing we need to realize is we're never actually alone. We never are. Now, I don't want to trivialize that because I understand that it's not always easy to feel connected to God or to even know if he's there. So I will never forget the first time I read C.S. Lewis's book, The Horse and His Boy. So this is one of the Narnia books. It's, I don't know which number in the series, but he published it about 4th or 5th. If you've never read this book, I think you need to read it. So the story is about a boy named Shasta. He is on a journey. And on this journey, he's not from Narnia. He's in this other land next to Narnia. And he knows nothing about Narnia. But he meets a horse from Narnia, and Narnia horses talk. But this talking horse is trapped among the beasts who don't talk. And he meets this boy, and they go on this journey together. Now, eventually, Shasta meets the great lion of Narnia named Aslan. And now Aslan in the Narnia stories is C.S. Lewis's version of Jesus in this world. So he really sees it as if in Narnia, Jesus is, the way people encounter him is at this great lion, Aslan. And in the human world, which there's humans who go between it in the Narnia world, they can encounter Jesus in their world, but they also encounter him in the Narnia world. So Shasta meets Jesus. He meets Aslan. Now on the journey, he's already met lions several times. He's had about 2 or 3 encounters with lions and other wild beasts. So he meets Aslan and he's terrified because he's already had so many run-ins with lions. And then this is what he learns from Aslan. Aslan tells him, there's only ever been one lion in the whole story. Then he says this. He says, I was the lion. I was the lion who forced you to join Aravis, his traveling companion. The lion brought them together because they were both running from the lions that were chasing their horses. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. And I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you could reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so it came near the shore where a man sat, wakeful at night, to receive you. In the story, Shasta didn't even know Aslan until the very end. He never even heard about him. He had to ask the horse, why do you keep saying this thing about the lion? And the horse had to tell him. But it didn't matter. The whole time, Aslan was there. We don't always know where and how God is working in our lives. But Jesus is the good shepherd, and he's going to be with us. I don't want to say that means everything goes well. Shasta got separated from his family. In that last line, whenever he was a little baby, Aslan didn't take him back to his family. He didn't even put him in the best situation, but he put him somewhere where he would survive. And then the story is about him going home and Aslan being there every step of the way. And that's our story. That's our story. We are lost at sea, but God is bringing us home. So the question is, do you believe that Jesus is the Good Shepherd? And more than that, do you actually believe that he does want to lay down his life for you? So let's look more at what he talks about laying down his life. Verse 12. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. So now Jesus is taking a poke at the religious leaders because they're supposed to be the ones caring for his people. But instead, they're trying to benefit themselves, and whenever push comes to shove, they run away. They abandon God's people. But the Good Shepherd is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. Because what does a Good Shepherd do? That's it. Puts the flock first. What does a good king do? Well, a good king was supposed to be the first into battle and the last out. Because if the king was really leading his people, that was his responsibility. Not to stand in the back and to watch, but to be in the front. What about a good captain? The first on their ship and the last off. I mean, we know the story of the Titanic. The captain, if anyone could get off the ship, it's the captain. But his responsibility and even the law requires him internationally to be with his ship and to make sure that he is responsible for every person on board before himself. This is how Jesus says that he is to live. Now, we don't have religious leaders that we're following. I understand that. Well, maybe there might be some religious people that you look to in your life. But we all have somebody that we're following and something that we're following. So we need to ask ourselves is, what are we following and where is it taking us? What is the path that we're on? What's at the end of that road? Because the religious leaders were leading Israel down the wrong path. And so Jesus comes and he says, you need to follow me, the Good Shepherd. Because what does Jesus want to do? He doesn't want to just save us from death. He offers himself in death so that we might find life. Because he is the Good Shepherd. And he's worth following. As he says in verse 14, he says, I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and he knows us. And he wants us to know him. And that's the invitation. And it's not just that, but look what he says. He says, I lay down my life for you. He had that power to lay it down and to take it up, and so he did. He didn't just protect us from death. He entered into death. Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. This is the story of Easter. That Jesus gave his life so we could find life. And in the view of the Good Shepherd, he offers his life and then takes it up again to lead us to life. Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. So when we think about loneliness, the first in the beginning of the answer of loneliness is Jesus, the Good Shepherd. He is always with us. Part of it is we have to be open to seeing him and open to encountering his love. But there's more to it than just Jesus. Because he does talk about us being part of his flock. So this is what John says in his reading that we heard earlier, just verse 16. Look what he says about this. He says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. So what John realizes is, yes, Jesus laid down his life for his people, for us, and he invites us to follow him down his path as our good shepherd. And on that path, there might be times where we put our life down for others. Now, for John and the people he's writing to, it could have been a real sort of situation. Now, for us, I don't think we necessarily need to think about laying down our lives actually, but I do think we need to think about sacrificing sometimes what we think we want or deserve, or what the world tells us we need, because we're choosing a different path. Because Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. And that's an invitation to follow him. And that leads to transformation. So what does this transformation change? And where does this love come from? Well, another thing that John says in verse 18, he says, "Dear children, let us not love with words and speech, but with actions and in truth." So the love isn't just something that we say, it's something that we do. It's something that we live. It's something that we embody. Like Jesus did. He didn't just say, "I'm going to save you." He actually offered himself and then was risen to save us. Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. Verse 19. Because we might still wonder, okay, well, how do I find this love? Well, this is what John says. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our hearts condemn us, we know that God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. So the key word is hearts. Now, in the first century, the heart was how you thought about what you wanted to do. It was about your emotions and your thoughts and your desires. Now, for us, the heart is about like your emotion. We might say something like we wear a heart on our sleeves, which means that our emotions are just always out and open. We don't hide that from people. But we would very clearly distinguish between emotions and, say, logic or reason. We would say that's in your head. And sometimes we actually pit the two against each other. In order to be reasonable, you should not be emotional or something. That's wrong. We need to see how it all comes together. And it's all centered on the inner part of us that leads our lives. It's like, well, who's driving the bus? The bus driver. Who's driving our lives? Whatever that thing is, whatever you want to call it, it's not our brain, because our brain is just a bunch of matter. It's something our brain interacts with inside of our bodies that we can't really understand. We can't really pinpoint. Science can't say, well, this is what that is. Because other creatures have brains, and it doesn't seem they have all these abilities that we have. But that is what gives us love. And so this is the question we ask ourselves. If we could look at that part of us, if we could somehow dissect, do like some sort of open heart surgery, but where it's like your brain and your mind and your heart, what would we find? Because John says, God knows what's there. And he says he knows if it condemns you. It doesn't matter what you show any of us. Now that does matter. But you could show everyone here the greatest love. You could put on the best show. But if your heart condemns you, it doesn't matter. And so what Jesus says is, he says, follow me, and I will transform your heart. Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. And finding life is about finding this transformation, where we're transformed to live love. And then John ends with this. He says, the one who keeps God's commands lives in him, and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit he gave us. The Spirit that lives and transforms us. Now understand, it's not a science. If it was a science, we could have figured it all out by now, but it's not. There's times where we're going to make mistakes. There's times where we're going to be wrong. There's times where we're not going to do the right thing. But where is our heart pointing, and what are we walking towards? Who are we following? Are we following the Good Shepherd? Are we living by the Spirit? Because Jesus gave his life so that we could find life, and we find life in the Spirit, which comes from Jesus. So when we go back to the loneliness epidemic, I think there's these two parts to the answer. The first part is God, the Good Shepherd. Are we following the Good Shepherd? And the second part is this: are we living love? If we're following the Good Shepherd, we're going to be people who live love. Because Jesus gave his life so that we could find life, and not just find that life, but share it by living love. So let me remind you of one of our core values here: seeking harmony, which I put this way. Now, I wrote this without having those definitions I told you in the beginning in mind. This is something I wrote, and I don't know, a year or two ago. I don't know when it all came to shape. But some of these words are very similar to what we heard in that report from the Surgeon General. Striving for relationships, so this is seeking harmony. It's striving for relationships with God and others that are grounded in a connection. Remember, that's they say, we all humans need a connection to other people that leads to a deep bond of trust, self-sacrifice, and love. I believe that God's people are the only ones with the true answer to the loneliness epidemic. It is about seeking harmony, which means deep connections with other humans and a deep connection with God. When you find that connection with God, you do see his work in your life, and it strengthens your trust, and it strengthens your connection to other humans. Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. So I think we should be people who are striving for that life, the life that Jesus gives. So we need to assess our lives. The loneliness epidemic didn't come about by accident. It's not a random happenstance. It's something about the very life that we live, the very life that our culture has invited us to be a part of. A life that values things that don't lead to true connection and happiness and love. But we know what does. And it starts with finding Jesus. So are we going to seek harmony? Are we going to seek to make the world better? Are we going to point people towards the Good Shepherd? Because Jesus gave his life so that we could find life. So today, my invitation is for us to do that. To let us find love that transforms our hearts so that we can share it with others.